My name is Leo Hines, and I am 74 years old. I live on the outskirts of Springfield, Missouri, in a small one-story house that I built with my own hands back in 1982, when my wife, Margaret, was still alive and the world seemed to stretch ahead without an end. These days, my world is smaller. It fits neatly inside the worn fence that circles my yard, the porch where I drink my morning coffee, and the workshop behind the house that used to hum with the sound of saws and laughter. That workshop was my cathedral, the only place where I still felt needed. I repaired old furniture, mostly antique pieces that neighbors brought me out of nostalgia rather than necessity. They said my hands had a gentleness you don't see anymore, the kind that remembers every nail and groove. I suppose that comes from years of teaching shop class at the local high school. For 35 years, I watched boys become men over the smell of sawdust and oil, showing them that patience and accuracy could build more than tables. It could build character. Margaret passed away 12 years ago. Stroke, quick and quiet like the closing of a door. After that, the house became hollow, echoing every step I took. My daughter, Ellen, did what she could at first. She came every weekend, brought casseroles, reminded me to take my pills. I used to think her kindness would last, but marriage changes people. She married a man named Rick Carver, loud, confident, all elbows and bright smiles. He worked in contracting and said he understood wood like an artist understands color. The first time he stepped into my workshop, he whistled and said, "You could make a fortune with this space, Leo. All that old junk could be turned into gold if you knew how to sell it right." I smiled politely and changed the subject. To him, everything had a price tag. To me, things only had meaning if they were built with care. As the years went by, Ellen's visits became shorter, the calls more formal, and the silences longer. I don't blame her entirely. She works long hours at the county clerk's office, and she's got 2 kids in college. Still, I noticed the way she looked around the house when she came by, like she was taking mental notes of what would be left behind someday. Rick encouraged it, of course. He always talked about planning for the future, in a tone that made me feel like the future was already over. Whenever I brought up Margaret, or the way the house felt empty without her, Ellen would say, "Dad, you should think about simplifying. Maybe sell the workshop. You don't need all that space anymore." I would nod and say, "Maybe next year." But I never meant it. That workshop was all I had left that was truly mine. Every morning followed the same pattern. I wake up before dawn, let the old dog out, and make coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. I'd walk the length of the yard, check the fence, and unlock the workshop door. Inside, the air smelled of linseed oil and old pine. I liked to sit for a moment on the stool by the workbench, hands folded, listening to the wind pushing through the trees. Sometimes I imagined Margaret's voice in that sound, soft and teasing, the way she used to ask why I spent more time sanding boards than talking to people. The answer was simple. Wood listens better than most folks do. Neighbors still brought me small jobs, fixing a chair leg, restoring a cabinet door, carving initials into cedar boxes for anniversaries. I never charged much, just enough to buy supplies. Some evenings, I'd pour myself a modest glass of bourbon and sit on the porch watching the sunset settle behind the hills, thinking about how time ages everything, even grief. In those moments, I didn't feel lonely so much as untethered, like a ship that's drifted too far from its dock. Rick and Ellen would stop by once in a while, usually unannounced. He'd walk around the yard pointing out things that could use an upgrade. "You could double the property's value if you tore down that shed and built a new unit here," he'd say, waving toward the workshop. I'd smile, pretending to consider it, though the thought of losing that place made my chest tighten. The workshop wasn't just a building. It was where I still felt alive. where every tool had its history, every dent a story. Rick never saw it that way. He saw the land beneath it, the square footage, the potential for profit. Ellen didn't argue with him. She'd just look away, biting her lip, the way Margaret used to when she wanted peace more than truth. The workshop had its own rhythm, its own quiet language. I kept a small radio on the shelf that played old jazz stations from Kansas City. The static didn't bother me. It made the music feel like it was traveling a long way just to reach me. I had a row of tools older than Rick himself, each cleaned and oiled, each with a name I'd given it decades ago. There was Old Betty, the hand plane with a chip on the handle, and George, the hammer that had survived a tornado when the school roof collapsed back in '89. To anyone else, it would look like clutter. To me, it was memory arranged in order. About 2 years ago, I had solar panels installed on the roof of the workshop. People thought it was extravagant for an old man to bother with that kind of technology, but I liked the idea of independence, light that didn't rely on anyone else's wires. The panels powered the lights, the heater, even the small set of security cameras I'd put up after a break-in a few winters back. It wasn't paranoia, just practicality. In my town, folks sometimes borrowed things and forgot to return them. I never mentioned the cameras to Ellen or Rick. I didn't want them to think I'd grown suspicious. Most evenings, I'd find myself writing in the notebook Margaret had given me on our 40th anniversary. It was leather-bound, with her handwriting still faintly visible on the first page. Keep your thoughts safe, love. I wrote about the weather, the neighborhood gossip, and sometimes, though I tried not to, about how quiet the house had become. When the loneliness got too heavy, I'd drive into town, buy groceries I didn't really need, and chat with the cashier, just to hear my own voice in conversation. Rick started dropping by alone last spring. Said Ellen was busy, but he liked to keep an eye on me. I didn't mind at first. We'd share a beer on the porch, and he'd talk about business, construction contracts, lumber prices, and the ridiculous cost of insurance these days. He mentioned insurance a lot, as if testing how I'd react. One day, he asked outright whether the workshop was insured. I told him I'd canceled the policy 6 months earlier. Too expensive, and besides, everything inside was worth more to me than to any adjuster with a clipboard. He nodded, but his smile tightened, like he'd just realized a bet he made wouldn't pay off. I remember that look because it chilled me for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, I sat awake for a long time, listening to the wind against the windows. The house creaked in that familiar way, but for the first time it didn't comfort me. I thought about Ellen, about how far apart we'd grown, about how she seemed to live more in Rick's shadow than her own light. I wondered if she even knew how much I still kept for her. The letters Margaret wrote when Ellen was born, the little cradle I built from oak, the old photo albums with her school drawings pressed between the pages. Everything that made this house more than lumber and shingles was built for love, not money. But love doesn't always survive the arithmetic of a new generation. Sometimes, when I walked through the yard at dusk, I'd see the reflection of the workshop's windows catching the dying sun, glowing faintly like the last ember of something that refused to go dark. I used to think if the world ever turned its back on me completely, I could still stand in that workshop and remember who I was. It was the last honest part of my life, a small square of wood and light and memory that belonged to no one else. I didn't know then that even sanctuaries can burn, and that sometimes the ones who strike the match are the same people you once held in your arms. It happened on a Tuesday night, one of those dry Colorado evenings when the wind rattles the trees, but the air feels hollow, like even nature is tired of pretending to care. I had gone to bed early, or at least I thought I had. My back had been acting up all day, and the pills I took around 8 barely dulled the ache. I remember lying there listening to the slow tick of the wall clock and thinking about calling Joshua in the morning, just to check on him, to offer him a little money for gas or groceries, something that would make me feel like a father again. I must have dozed off, because the next sound I heard was not the clock, but the faint clatter of metal against metal, followed by the dull scrape of a cabinet hinge. For a moment I thought it was a dream, the kind that drags an echo from the past. But then I realized I was fully awake. The sound was coming from the kitchen. I sat up slowly, the brace around my ribs digging in as I reached for the nightstand lamp. The light made the room look smaller, emptier. I reached under the bed for the bat I keep there and shuffled toward the doorway, my socks sliding on the wooden floor. The sound came again, softer this time, like someone trying not to be heard. When I turned the corner into the hallway, the smell of menthol ointment from the bathroom mixed with something sharper, a synthetic sweetness that reminded me of hospitals. My heart began to hammer in that way it does when an old fear returns, uninvited but familiar. The kitchen door was half open, and the dim light from the fridge spilled onto the linoleum. For a second, I saw nothing but the shape of my own reflection in the glass. Then I saw him. Joshua stood in front of the open cabinet, his back to me, one hand rummaging through the shelves. His movements were quick, practiced, not the fumbling of a man searching for aspirin, but the deliberate precision of someone who knows exactly what he's looking for. The small orange pill bottle glinted between his fingers. My stomach dropped. I called his name before I could stop myself. He turned sharply, eyes wide, pupils blown wide like a startled animal's. "Dad," he said, his voice catching halfway between guilt and irritation. "You scared me. I couldn't sleep, had a headache, thought you had some Tylenol." I stared at the bottle in his hand. It wasn't Tylenol. He noticed where I was looking and moved his hand behind his back. I didn't say anything at first. I just kept my eyes on him the way you'd watch a fuse burning down. "That's my prescription," I finally said. "You shouldn't be touching it." He smiled the kind of smile that tries to turn a lie into a joke. "Relax. I wasn't going to take any. I just grabbed the wrong one." He put the bottle back on the counter, but not before his thumb flicked the cap open and I heard the faint rattle of pills. 3 were missing, maybe 4. My throat tightened. I told him to go home. He looked at me for a long time, as if measuring whether I was serious. Then he laughed, that low, humorless laugh that used to make me proud when he was a teenager, because it meant he had inherited my deep voice. Now it sounded like a stranger's. "You're overreacting, Dad," he said. "You've been forgetting things lately. You probably misplaced them." I wanted to shout, to tell him I'm not senile, not yet, but the words caught in my throat. He walked past me, patted my shoulder like I was a child, and said, "Get some sleep, old man." The door slammed behind him. I stood there for a long while, staring at the half-empty bottle. I counted the pills twice, then a third time, just to be sure. 15 left, when there should have been 19. I set the bottle down carefully, almost reverently, as though handling evidence of something sacred that had been violated. The silence afterward was so deep I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the pipes, the trembling in my own hands. There are moments when the world tilts just slightly, not enough to knock you down, but enough to make you realize it will never be level again. That was one of them. The next morning I told myself it had to be a misunderstanding. Joshua was exhausted, confused, maybe even desperate, but not malicious. He was my son. The mind invents mercy when the heart refuses to accept reality. I tried to go about my day as usual. I made my coffee, took the dog tags from the drawer where I keep them, rubbed them between my fingers for luck, and sat on the porch to watch the sunrise. The air smelled like cold earth and pine sap. The world looked normal, but the illusion was too thin to hold. Every time the wind moved the trees, I thought I heard footsteps. Every time the house creaked, I felt watched. That afternoon, Elle came by. He took one look at me and said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I told him I hadn't slept well. He poured a little whiskey into his coffee, the way he always does, and said nothing for a while. Then he leaned forward and said quietly, "Saw your boy's car here last night around 11. Left in a hurry. You two have words?" I told him it was nothing, just a misunderstanding. Elle nodded, but his eyes stayed on me in that steady way veterans have when they recognize another man's denial. Before leaving, he said, "Keep your doors locked, George, even the ones you never used to lock." That night I hid the pills in a different drawer behind the old photo albums. I told myself it was temporary, just until Joshua got back on his feet. But when I lay down, the guilt kept me awake. The ceiling above my bed looked like cracked porcelain in the moonlight. I thought about all the times I'd looked the other way when he asked for money, when he came home smelling of something chemical and foreign, when his words slurred slightly as he swore he'd quit drinking, quit whatever else it was he'd started. I thought about Grace and how she used to say, "You can't protect a man from his own reflection." Maybe she'd been talking about me too. 2 days later, I woke to find the back door unlocked. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the drawer where I had hidden the pills was slightly open. The bottles were still there, but when I shook one, the weight felt wrong. I poured the contents into my palm. Most of them were aspirin, not opioids. He had switched them. My son had stood in my home, looked me in the eye, and replaced my medication with sugar pills. The betrayal felt physical, as if something sharp had been lodged beneath my ribs. I didn't call the police. I didn't even call Elle. I sat at the table all morning, waiting for the phone to ring, hoping Joshua would call, confess, apologize, anything that would give me an excuse to forgive him. He didn't. Around noon, I drove into town to refill my prescription. The pharmacist looked at me with polite suspicion when I requested an early refill, the kind reserved for addicts and liars. I could feel her judgment pressing on me as she said, "You still have a few days left on the last bottle, Mr. Coulter." I lied. I said I'd spilled them down the sink. She hesitated, then handed me the new bottle. I drove home with it on the passenger seat, feeling like a thief in my own story. That night, I placed the bottle inside the small metal lockbox where I keep my discharge papers and Grace's wedding ring. I locked it and slid it under the bed. Then I sat in the dark, listening to the steady wheeze of the furnace, the sound of my own breathing, and the echo of Grace's voice in my head telling me that love, without boundaries, turns into something cruel. I didn't want to believe that my son could hurt me, but the truth was already in motion. Quiet as a thief, unstoppable as the sunrise. 2 days after the fire, I woke to a quiet so deep it felt unnatural. The yard was still gray with ash, the workshop nothing but a scorched outline against the field beyond. The birds hadn't yet come back, and even the dog refused to cross the charred ground, as if the place itself had absorbed too much pain. I made coffee, black and strong, and sat at the kitchen table staring out the window at what used to be my reason to get up in the morning. I tried to tell myself that the loss was just another lesson in letting go, another reminder that everything built by hand eventually turns to dust. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rick's face when I told him there was no insurance. that flicker of something ugly, like a mask slipping. It replayed in my mind over and over until I stopped pretending it didn't mean anything. That afternoon, Ellen came alone. She brought a casserole in that careful, overly gentle tone she uses when she's afraid I might break down. She walked through the yard in silence, her shoes crunching the burned gravel, and stopped near the remains of the workshop. "I can't believe it's gone," she whispered. "You spent half your life in there." I said nothing. Words seemed pointless. She turned to me, eyes shiny with guilt. "Dad, Rick feels terrible. He wanted to come, but he's been dealing with work stuff. He asked if you needed help cleaning up." I told her I wasn't ready. The fire inspectors hadn't finished, and I didn't want anyone touching what was left. She nodded, but looked uneasy. "They said it started from the back corner," she added. "Could have been that old heater." "It wasn't," I said quietly. She frowned. "You can't know that." "Yes," I answered. "I can." Her expression changed, half pity, half frustration, the way people look at the elderly when they think senility is peeking through. "Dad, you've been through a lot. Sometimes these things—" "Ellen," I interrupted, keeping my voice steady. "Someone poured gasoline near the door. I smelled it before the fire." She blinked, uncertain. "What are you saying?" I didn't want to say it aloud. Saying it would make it real. "I think someone said it on purpose." She stared at me for a long moment and then exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Dad, please don't start with that. Fires happen. Circuits go bad. You can't turn everything into some kind of mystery." I didn't argue. There was no point. People believe what they can handle, and Ellen couldn't handle the idea that her husband might have had anything to do with it. When she left, I sat for a long time by the window, watching her car disappear down the road, the dust rising in the sun. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pressing against the walls. That evening, I poured myself a small drink and went out to the yard with a flashlight. The moon was high, bright enough to paint the ground in silver. I crouched near the remains of the back door and ran my hand through the dirt. Beneath the soot, there was a faint, oily residue, dark and slick. Gasoline doesn't lie. It lingers in the earth longer than truth in a human mouth. The next morning, the fire investigator returned. His name was Miller, a polite young man with clean boots this time and a clipboard tucked under his arm. He said he needed to check the site once more before closing the report. I watched him work, his movements neat and methodical. When he reached the back door, he paused, sniffed, then scribbled something down. "You smell that?" I asked. He hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Could be residual fuel. We'll test for accelerants just to be sure." "That means someone used gasoline," I said flatly. He looked uncomfortable. "Let's not jump ahead, sir. Sometimes containers leak." "Not mine," I said. My gas can was sealed. He offered a polite smile, the kind professionals give to old men who sound too certain. "We'll know soon," he said and left. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing echoes of Margaret's voice in my mind, the way she used to say, "You always see too much, Leo. Sometimes it's better not to know." I understood what she meant now. Knowing doesn't bring peace. It only replaces confusion with anger. Around midnight, I turned on the small monitor that connected to the security cameras. I hadn't checked them since the fire. The system was powered separately by solar energy, and though the cameras themselves had melted, the recordings were stored on a hard drive inside the house. When the screen flickered to life, I scrolled through the dates. Most of the files were fine until the night of the fire. The recording started at 1:12 a.m., grainy but clear. I saw the yard bathed in moonlight, the workshop dark and still. Then, at 1:34, a figure appeared from the right side of the frame, moving carefully along the fence. The resolution was low, but the posture, the way the shoulders rolled forward, the heavy step, it was unmistakable. Rick. He moved toward the back of the workshop, carrying something. A red container, just the size and shape of my gas can. He stopped near the door, glanced around once, and disappeared from view. A few seconds later, light flickered in the window, faint at first, then brighter. He reappeared, walking quickly back the way he came. My stomach turned cold. The timestamp read 1:36 a.m. By 1:38, the first orange glow filled the frame. I stopped the video and sat there in the dark. The only sound, my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. I wanted to be wrong. I replayed the footage 3 more times, hoping for a different shape, a different walk, some trick of the light. But the truth stayed where it was, simple, merciless, and final. When morning came, I looked 10 years older. My hands shook as I made coffee, and the house felt smaller than ever. I didn't call the police. I didn't even call Ellen. Instead, I copied the footage onto a small flash drive and locked it in Margaret's old jewelry box. I needed time to think. Confrontation without strategy is suicide, and Rick wasn't the kind of man who lost gracefully. Around noon, he showed up, unannounced as always, driving that oversized pickup that made the ground tremble. He got out with his usual swagger, holding 2 cups of coffee like we were old friends. "Morning, Leo," he said too cheerfully. "Figured you could use this. Long week, huh?" I stood on the porch, keeping my face neutral. "You could say that." He handed me the cup. "Any word from the fire guys?" "They're still checking things." "Yeah, those bureaucrats take forever. But don't worry, I've got a buddy who can get you a cleanup crew cheap. They'll clear this out in no time." He gestured toward the ruins as if he were doing me a favor. I didn't answer. I watched him instead, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided looking directly at the workshop. He was nervous, though trying not to show it. "You know," he continued, "if you had the place insured, this would have worked out nicely. Could have even upgraded to a full garage. Maybe next time, huh?" I looked him straight in the eye. "There won't be a next time, Rick. I'm done building things for other people to burn." He laughed, too loudly. "Come on, don't be dramatic. Fires happen. Bad luck, that's all." Then he changed the subject, asking about the dog, the weather, the kind of meaningless chatter people use when they're buying time. Before he left, he mentioned Ellen. "She's been worried, you know. Thinks you're not sleeping. Maybe you should come stay with us for a bit." His voice softened, almost persuasive. "Might do you good. Fresh air, family, a bit of company. That house must feel mighty empty now." I felt the hair rise on my arms. There was something in his tone, not compassion, but calculation. "I'm fine here," I said. "This house suits me just fine." His smile tightened again. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't offer." He tipped his coffee cup and a mock toast and left. That night, I replayed the video again, forcing myself to watch every frame until the sight of his movement burned itself into my mind. I realized something then. The fire hadn't been an act of desperation. It had been planned. He thought the workshop was insured. He thought he'd burn it down, file a claim in my name, and pocket the money before I even noticed. But he'd made 2 mistakes. The first was assuming I was careless enough to leave the insurance running. The second was forgetting that my cameras didn't depend on the grid. They ran on the same sunlight that now revealed his crime. Over the next few days, Ellen called several times, asking if Rick had been by. I told her yes, and she sounded relieved. "Good," she said. "He's been worried about you." I wanted to tell her everything, to send her the video, to make her see what kind of man she'd married. But every time I heard her voice, I pictured the years she'd invested in him, the way she looked at him when she thought no one was watching, a woman desperate to believe she'd chosen right. The truth would destroy her, and part of me still wanted to protect what little was left of our bond. Instead, I told her something else. "I've been thinking of redoing my will," I said casually. There was a pause. "Your will? Why now?" "Just time," I said. "I'm not getting younger." She hesitated again. "Should I tell Rick? He knows a good lawyer." "No need," I replied. "I'll handle it myself." She didn't argue, but I heard the unease in her breathing. Rick would hear about it soon enough, and that was exactly what I wanted. The next morning, a white envelope was slipped under my front door. No address, no note, just a single sheet of paper inside. A quote from a cleanup company for debris removal and site reconstruction. At the bottom, in sloppy handwriting, it said, "Talk to Rick before signing anything." I stared at it for a long time, then folded it neatly and placed it beside the flash drive in the jewelry box. My hands were steady now. Fear had turned to purpose. That night, as the wind moved through the bare trees, I went out to the yard one last time. The moonlight caught the ashes, making them shimmer faintly like frost. I realized then that the fire hadn't just destroyed what I built. It had cleared the ground for something else. I no longer saw the ruins as loss, but as proof. Proof of who Rick truly was, and of what I was still capable of doing about it. For years, I'd been shrinking, letting life and family make me small. But standing there among the ashes, I felt a quiet strength return. The same strength that once built a life out of nothing but 2 hands and love. Rick thought the fire had taken everything from me. He didn't know it had given me something back. Resolve. 3 days passed before the official fire report arrived, printed on thick white paper that still smelled faintly of the department's printer ink. The report was short, clinical, written in the flat tone of bureaucracy that makes tragedy sound like routine. Cause: undetermined, probable accelerant use. The words bled through the page in my mind long after I put it down. I sat at the kitchen table staring at that sentence until the letters blurred, thinking about how something so small, so detached, could contain the weight of everything I had lost. The word accelerant clung to me like smoke. I imagined the investigator, Miller, with his polite voice and clean hands, typing those words without understanding what they really meant to the man who lived inside them. He didn't know that accelerant had a name, a face, a handshake, and a place at my family's dinner table. That same afternoon, Ellen called again. She sounded bright, forcedly cheerful, as if she were rehearsing normalcy. "Dad, Rick says we can help rebuild," she began. "He knows some people who can get materials at cost. It won't be the same, but—" I cut her off gently. "There's not going to be a rebuild." Silence followed. Then a sigh, the kind that said she was trying not to argue. "Dad, you can't just give up. You need a project, something to keep you busy." I told her I had something else in mind. She didn't ask what. I could hear the unspoken worry in her pause, that I might be slipping, losing myself to age and grief. Before she hung up, she said softly, "Rick's been worried about you, too." I almost laughed. Worried, yes, about the wrong thing catching up to him. That night, I pulled the flash drive from the jewelry box and plugged it into my old laptop. The footage looked even more damning on the larger screen. Every flicker of flame, every step Rick took clear as daylight. I zoomed in on his face as he turned briefly toward the camera. just enough light to catch the curve of his jaw, the angle of his nose. There was no doubt left. He had done it. I copied the video twice more and placed the drives in separate envelopes, labeling one for Ellen Carver and the other for Springfield Police Department. But I didn't send them. Not yet. Evidence can end a story, but sometimes you need the story to run a little longer before it closes. Over the next week, I moved through my days like a man rehearsing invisibility. I walked to the mailbox, nodded at neighbors, and pretended I was still just an old widower with nothing left to lose. I saw Rick twice, once when he drove by slowly, pretending not to notice me on the porch, and again when he parked in front of the house and came up the steps with a forced smile. "Just checking in," he said, carrying a box of nails and a new hammer, as if that somehow bridged the gulf between us. "Thought you might want to start salvaging what's left." I told him I'd already decided what to do. "Oh yeah? What's that?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "I'm talking to a lawyer tomorrow," I said. His eyes narrowed. "About what?" "Estate stuff," I replied. "House, land, what's left of the workshop." He shifted his weight. "You're not planning to sell, are you?" "No," I said. "Just planning." For a moment, I saw something dark cross his face. Not fear, but irritation, the kind a man feels when his plan starts to fray. "Well," he said after a beat, "let me know if you need me to look over anything. You know, paperwork can get tricky." I nodded, knowing exactly what he wanted. Access, a way to see how close he was to inheriting what he thought he deserved. But I gave him nothing. He stayed for another minute, staring out at the charred ground, as if trying to read my thoughts, then left without saying goodbye. The next morning I drove into town for the first time since the fire. People stared. Small-town curiosity disguised as sympathy. "Saw what happened, Leo," they said. "Terrible thing. You holding up?" I nodded, mumbled something polite. But I wasn't there for condolences. I parked outside the office of a local lawyer named Harold Pierce, a man I'd known for years through the school district. He greeted me warmly, his handshake firm, his eyes the color of old denim. "Leo," he said, "I was sorry to hear about the fire. What brings you in today?" I told him I needed to revise my will. His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't ask why. "Of course," he said. "Do you have the old one with you?" I handed him the folder. We went over the details slowly. The original will left everything to Ellen, with the understanding that she'd take care of the property after I was gone. This time I told him I wanted to make a few changes. I'd like to leave the land and what's left of the workshop to the Springfield High School Vocational Department, I said. They could build something useful there, maybe a learning center for kids who don't have much. Harold nodded, making notes. "And the house?" he asked. "To the school as well," I said. "They can use it for staff housing or sell it if they need funds." He looked up, surprised. "Nothing for Ellen?" "No," I said quietly. "Not anymore." He didn't press further. Instead, he adjusted his glasses, signed a few pages, and said, "You understand this will take effect immediately upon signing." I told him I did. When I left his office, I felt lighter. Not happy, but unburdened. It's a strange thing, how taking back control, even quietly, can feel like revenge, wearing the face of peace. That evening, I placed one of the flash drives in an envelope addressed to Ellen. I didn't mail it yet. I just wanted it ready. As I sealed the flap, the phone rang. Rick's voice came through the line, casual as always. "Ellen told me you went to see a lawyer today," he said. "Mind if I ask what that's about?" "No, Rick," I said. "You don't mind, or no, you won't tell me?" he asked, his tone tightening. "Both." There was a pause. I could hear him exhale through his nose. "You know, Leo, Families work best when everyone's transparent. Secrets make things ugly. Yes, I said, they do. Another pause. Then he said quietly, You don't want to make this harder than it has to be. The words hung there, heavy and deliberate. I didn't answer. He waited, then hung up. That night I couldn't shake his voice. There was something final in it, something that didn't sound like a threat, but a promise. I knew Rick well enough to understand he'd come back, not with fire this time, but with manipulation, maybe worse. I started sleeping with the flash drive in my pocket, like a talisman. On the fourth night, just past midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Soft, deliberate. I reached for the old baseball bat by the door and moved to the window. A shadow crossed the yard, tall and broad. For a moment it paused near the ashes of the workshop, then turned toward the porch. My pulse hammered in my ears. The motion light flickered on, bathing the figure in a cold wash of white. Rick stood there, his face half lit, staring at the house, as if deciding whether to knock. Then, after a few seconds, he turned and walked away. The next morning, I told Ellen he'd come by. She sounded startled. At night? He didn't mention that. No reason he would, I said. Maybe he just wanted to check on things. She hesitated, then said, Dad, please don't turn this into something it's not. I almost laughed at that. Something it's not. If only she knew. But I let her have her illusion. People need their lies. They're softer to sleep on than truth. 2 days later, I drove to the school to meet with the principal, a man named Curtis Holt. I explained my donation, the land, the remaining assets, and his eyes widened with disbelief. Leo, that's incredibly generous, he said. You're sure about this? I'm sure, I said. Just promise me one thing. Build something that lasts. He clasped my hand and said they would. I believed him. That meeting was the first time in weeks I'd felt something close to calm. But calm doesn't last long when evil knows your address. That evening, I returned home to find the mailbox open and empty. Not unusual, except I hadn't put out any mail. I went inside, checked the envelope with the flash drive I'd prepared for Ellen. Gone. The jewelry box where I'd kept the second copy was also disturbed, the lid slightly askew. I froze. Someone had been inside. I searched the house, every room, every window. Nothing was broken, but the back door lock had been tampered with, the metal scratched near the latch. I sat down slowly, realizing what it meant. Rick had been here. For the first time since the fire, fear outweighed anger. I imagined him standing in my living room, rifling through drawers, breathing my air, searching for evidence of his own crime. But what he didn't know, couldn't know, was that I had made one more copy, hidden in a place no one would think to look, taped beneath the seat of Margaret's rocking chair, the one I'd salvaged from the fire before the wreckage cooled. Its charred frame now sat in the corner of the living room like a silent witness, holding both memory and proof. I didn't call the police that night. I didn't even call Ellen. I just sat in the dim light, watching the shadows shift across the floor, and understood the full scale of the game Rick was playing. He thought he was ahead, that he could scare me into silence or force my hand. But the truth was something I'd learned long ago from years of teaching stubborn boys with saws and nails. When pressure builds too fast, wood doesn't bend. It snaps. The next morning I wrote a letter, not to Rick or Ellen, but to myself. I wrote, When a man loses everything, he stops fearing loss. And when fear is gone, what's left is justice. I folded the page, placed it inside the envelope meant for the police, and sealed it shut. It wasn't a confession. It was a reminder. The middle of a story is where the line between victim and executioner begins to blur. Rick thought the fire was the end of mine, but he didn't realize he'd only lit the midpoint. The real blaze, the one he'd never see coming, hadn't even begun. The days blurred together after the report came. The neighbors stopped asking questions, and Ellen's calls grew shorter, almost scripted. She wanted to sound calm, but every sentence carried the strain of someone trying to keep two loyalties from colliding. When she mentioned Rick now, she used the same careful voice she'd used when she was 12 and hiding a bad grade. I knew she had seen something in him, maybe not the whole truth, but enough to make her uneasy, and that knowledge was turning into silence. Inside the house, I began to move differently. Every drawer had its purpose, every lock a reason. I stopped sleeping through the night, sitting instead by the window with the lights off, listening to the hum of the quiet street. The moonlight on the burned ground reminded me of the classroom after the last bell. Everything still, waiting for a sound that wouldn't come. When Ellen did visit, she came alone. Her eyes looked hollow, the way Margaret's had when she was hiding her headaches. "Dad," she said, "I think Rick's under a lot of pressure at work. He's not himself." She waited for me to answer, and when I didn't, she added, "He says you've been distant. He's trying to help." I asked her if she believed that. She hesitated too long before saying yes. I realized then that truth doesn't break people. It bends them until they can't tell which way is upright. I didn't blame her. Love blinds faster than smoke. A week later, I drove into town, left an envelope at Harold Pierce's office, and said nothing about its contents. I'd written out everything, dates, copies of receipts, even the recordings from my cameras, and asked that, if anything happened to me, the materials go straight to the authorities. The simple act of leaving it there steadied my hands. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I was preparing for clarity. Back home, I began to sort through what was left of the workshop debris, choosing what could be saved. Under one sheet of blackened tin, I found a small box of screws untouched by the fire. Their metal glinted in the sun, like a quiet reminder that not everything burns the same way. I kept them on the windowsill, a private memorial of sorts, something to catch the light in the mornings. Later that evening, Ellen called again. Her voice trembled when she asked if I was all right, if I had been sleeping, if I could forgive her for not visiting more. I told her there was nothing to forgive. "People change," I said. "Sometimes it takes the worst things to show us what we already knew." She was silent for a long time. "Dad," she whispered finally, "you're scaring me." I almost told her everything then, the footage, the signatures, the insurance lies. But I stopped. She would learn it when she was ready, when truth came from someone other than me. For now, I only said, "Don't worry, Ellen. Everything's in order now." That night I slept for the first time in weeks. Outside, the yard was dark and still, and the wind moved through the trees without resistance. I dreamed of Margaret in her garden, her hands covered in soil, smiling the way she used to when something had finally begun to grow. By the time April bled into May, the lilacs had returned, stubborn things that they are, sprouting even through the ash where the workshop had stood. Their scent filled the yard each morning, sweet and heavy, almost mocking the ruin beneath. I spent most of my days outside, rebuilding small pieces of the fence and pretending the sound of the hammer was just another heartbeat. The work steadied me. It reminded me that creation, however small, is still an answer to loss. One Thursday afternoon, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail from the fire department. It contained the final confirmation. Traces of fuel, clear signs of deliberate ignition, and a note that the investigation had been turned over to local authorities. The report was concise, impersonal, but to me it was scripture, proof, printed in black ink, that the world had not imagined my suspicion. I read it once, then placed it carefully beside Margaret's old photograph on the table. That evening I called Ellen. I told her only that the report was finished, that she might want to see it. She hesitated, then said she'd come by after dinner. When her car pulled into the drive an hour later, I saw that she was alone. She looked tired, older than I remembered, and there was something brittle in her smile. "Rick's working late," she said quickly, as though to fill the air. We went inside, and I poured her coffee. For a few minutes we sat without speaking. Finally, I slid the report across the table. She read in silence, her fingers trembling slightly as her eyes moved over the words. When she reached the last page, she looked up at me. Her lips parted, but no sound came. I didn't need to explain. She understood. She set the papers down and stared out the window toward the blackened patch of ground. "Dad," she whispered, "you think he—" Her voice broke before the sentence finished. I didn't answer. Silence sometimes tells the truth more clearly than speech. After a long moment, she said, "If it's true, I don't know what I'll do." I told her she didn't have to decide anything tonight. "Sometimes," I said, "the right thing finds you when you're ready to stop running from it." She nodded, eyes glistening, and for the first time in years she reached across the table and held my hand. We stayed like that until the coffee went cold. The next morning I visited Harold Pierce again. I handed him a second envelope, this one sealed and unmarked. "If my daughter or anyone from law enforcement asks," I said, "you can release it." He gave a slow, understanding nod, the way people do when words aren't needed. On my way out, I felt lighter again. There's a strange calm that comes when everything you were afraid of finally stands in the open. That evening, Ellen returned. Her face was pale but resolved. She told me she had spoken with Rick after reading the report. "He didn't deny it," she said softly. "He said it was a mistake, that he thought it would help us all somehow, that you'd be compensated. He said he didn't mean to hurt you." Her voice cracked. "Dad, I can't even recognize the person he's become." I didn't respond right away. I simply listened, letting the weight of her words settle. Finally, I said, "Sometimes people reveal themselves only when they think no one is watching. Now you've seen him clearly." She cried for a long time, and I let her. The house that had felt empty for so many years now held the sound of grief again, honest, painful, cleansing. When she left that night, she hugged me harder than she had since she was a little girl. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything I didn't see." I told her there was nothing to forgive. Some lessons, I said, arrive in their own season. After she drove away, I walked out to the yard. The moon was full, casting long, thin shadows across the ground, where the workshop used to stand. I could still picture the shelves, the tools, the light spilling through the window in the mornings. For a long time, I just stood there breathing in the cool air, listening to the night. Then I did what I had planned for weeks. I opened the small box of screws I'd salvaged and began laying them into the soil one by one, marking the outline where the walls had once been. It wasn't rebuilding exactly. It was remembrance turned into form. Each piece of metal caught the moonlight, glinting like a quiet vow that this place, and what had happened here, would not be erased. The next day Ellen called again. Her voice was steadier. She said Rick had left the house, that she'd spoken with the authorities, that everything would move forward properly now. She sounded drained, but free. "I don't know what comes next," she said, "but at least it's honest." I told her that was enough. When we hung up, I felt something I hadn't in years, a stillness that wasn't emptiness, but peace. That night I sat on the porch with the dog at my feet, the stars scattered above like bits of metal waiting to be shaped into something new. I realized the story of the fire was never about destruction, not really. It was about the quiet reckoning that comes when truth refuses to stay buried. Some men spend their lives building, others destroying, but the hardest work is learning to endure the spaces in between. Before I went to bed, I looked once more at the field, at the faint shimmer where the screws marked the boundary of what used to be. The wind moved through the lilacs, carrying a scent that was both past and present. I thought of Margaret, of Ellen, even of Rick, and felt a strange tenderness for all of it, the love, the loss, the foolishness of believing that anything can be owned forever. Then I closed the door, turned off the light, and let the darkness settle, not as an enemy, but as a companion that finally, after so much noise, asked nothing of me at all. Summer came slowly that year, as if unsure whether it was welcome. The grass grew back in uneven patches over the burned earth, and with every rain the black faded a little more to the color of soil. The air turned softer, carrying the smell of clover and the low buzz of cicadas that made the nights hum like an old machine returning to life. I spent most mornings sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, the kind Margaret used to make too strong, and listened to the world rebuilding itself one quiet sound at a time. The silence that had once felt like punishment had changed its shape. It had become something closer to understanding. I wasn't waiting for anyone anymore, not for Ellen's car to appear at the gate, or for the sound of Rick's truck to break the stillness. For the first time in a long while, I was simply present. The authorities kept me informed at a distance. There were phone calls, polite voices, the routine rhythm of procedure. They didn't need me to testify. The footage and reports had said enough. From what I was told, Rick had confessed, half admission, half excuse, talking about desperation, debt, and the twisted logic of trying to make loss look like rescue. I didn't listen for details. The truth, once spoken, becomes less interesting. I only asked that they keep Ellen out of the noise as much as they could. They did. Justice, when it finally arrives, is quieter than people imagine. Ellen came by often after that. At first she would sit stiffly, unsure of what to say, and then gradually the words began to return, small and domestic. Groceries, weather, the grandchildren. It was like watching a plant find light after being kept too long in shadow. One evening she brought Jacob, my grandson, tall now and restless, with the same curious eyes she'd had at his age. He asked if he could see where the workshop had been. I took him out back and showed him the outline of screws shining faintly under the sun. "Why did you leave them there?" he asked. "Because they remember better than I do," I said, and he nodded, not pretending to understand, but respecting the answer. Before he left, he promised to come back and help me build a garden there. Not another shop, just a place where things could grow. I told him I'd like that very much. As weeks passed, I began to clear the rest of the debris. Piece by piece, the wreckage disappeared, replaced by rows of marigolds and herbs that smelled of lemon and mint when brushed by the wind. The soil that had once held only ash now held life again. It wasn't a resurrection, not in the holy sense, but something smaller and more human. Persistence. The neighbors who had once watched from their porches began to stop by with seedlings, old pots, and quiet congratulations. In a town like ours, gossip fades faster than kindness. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the school district. They had finalized the paperwork for the donation. The land and the remaining estate would become a small educational center for students learning carpentry and restoration. The Leo Hines Workshop for Craft and Design. The words looked strange on paper, not proud or triumphant, just steady, like the grain of oak running through a plank. I smiled, thinking Margaret would have liked that. She always said the best legacy is usefulness. Ellen came the next day with a framed copy of the letter. She had tears in her eyes when she handed it to me. "You did something good, Dad," she said. I told her we all had, that sometimes good things grow out of what tried to destroy us. She hugged me, and for the first time in years, I felt her heartbeat against mine, quick and certain. It was the sound of a bridge being rebuilt plank by plank. In the evenings, when the sun sinks low and the garden turns gold, I still think about the fire, but not with bitterness. I think of it as the last lesson life gave me, the one about how easily things fall apart and how patiently they can be remade. There are nights when the wind carries the scent of smoke from someone's chimney down the valley, and for a second, it tricks me into thinking the workshop is alive again, that I'll open the door and see sawdust swirling in the air and hear the old radio humming some tune from long ago. Then the wind shifts and the garden comes back into focus, bright with color, honest in its silence. I have stopped keeping the flash drives, the papers, the proof. All that is locked away now in places that no longer need guarding. What remains is the work of the hands, the simple acts of planting, fixing, mending. I talk to Margaret when I water the garden, not because I believe she hears me, but because it feels like the right kind of prayer. Sometimes Ellen joins me, and we plant side by side without needing to say much. Jacob visits on weekends, learning to cut boards straight and true. The rhythm of life has become slower but clearer, like a song played on an instrument that has lost its shine, but kept its tune. As for Rick, I think of him only occasionally, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of distant pity. He built his life on shortcuts, always chasing what looked like gain, never seeing that value lives in time and patience. I've outlived his noise, and that's enough. When dusk falls, I sit on the porch with the dog beside me and the smell of lilacs thick in the air. The lights from the school glow faintly beyond the trees, and I imagine the sound of hammers and laughter drifting from a new workshop rising where mine once stood. It feels right that young hands will build where fire once took everything. I lift my cup of coffee toward that quiet light and whisper a small thank you to Margaret, to Ellen, to whatever mercy let me live long enough to see that even ruin can turn into a beginning. Then I close my eyes and let the evening settle around me, content in the gentle truth that forgiveness, like wood, is strongest after the grain has been tested by flame.